Hello, my name is Robbie Carlton, and welcome to Learn React in about 4 videos. So, we're going to be learning React in about 4 videos. I might make a fifth, I'm not sure yet. So, first of all, who is this tutorial for? This tutorial is for you if you know some JavaScript and some HTML. That's all you need. You don't really need any CSS. There will be CSS, but you can just copy and paste it. You definitely don't need to know React. That would kind of defeat the point. But you do need a little bit of JavaScript. I will be hopefully explaining the more kind of advanced JavaScript concepts as we go. But the basics you do need to know, and you also just need to know the very basics of HTML. If you go, there are many places you can learn. If you just Google learn basic JavaScript, learn basic HTML. It shouldn't take you too long, especially with the HTML. JavaScript might take you a little bit longer, and then come back and you can learn React. So this video is for you if you know at least a little bit of JavaScript or a little bit of HTML. You might know a lot of JavaScript and a lot of HTML. That is also great if you don't know React, because we're going to learn React in these videos. The first video is going to be what is React, and then talking about components. The second video is going to be about state. The third video is also going to be about state because it's really important and we want to talk about it twice, kind of basic state and then a little bit more advanced state. And then the fourth video is going to be about use effect, which you don't know what that is, but you will by the end of the fourth video. And so let's talk about React. So what is React? React is a JavaScript library. It's a JavaScript library for building UIs, user interfaces. So it's especially and most often used for building user interfaces which are delivered through a web browser. So those are websites, and especially what you would call a web app or a single page app. So I'm not going to go into detail about what those things are, but basically if you want to build a website which has some interactivity where the user is able to do things and it responds in real time, and it's not just like serving static information and then maybe you fill out a form and you hit submit and then it gives you a new page with static information, but instead it's kind of dynamic. It's loading things from the server in real time. So think of something like Gmail or Facebook or basically anything. A modern web app is going to be a single page app most likely, and React is a great tool for building that kind of app. Now, this whole video series is going to be about React. React is for building front ends. It's for building user interfaces. So we're not going to talk about all of the back-end stuff that is required for making those websites. You can learn about that in other places, and maybe later on I'll do a video tutorial about building a back end. But for right now, we're just going to build a front end. I'm now going to show you the front end that we're going to build so that you know where we're going. We're not going to do this by the end of this first video. We're going to do this by the end of the whole series. But here it is. So it's a Kanban board. A Kanban board, if you're not familiar with that, it's just a series of lanes, and it kind of records the status of different pieces of work. So imagine you're working on a team. All of these are tickets that represent work that's either to be done or has been done or some way in process. It's in process or it's in review. And so features of this app is we can add a new ticket. So say we just find out, oh man, there's something is even more broken and even more urgent bug. And we can add that ticket. And here we go. So now we have a new ticket in the ready column. We can move this ticket. Okay, I need to start working on this because it's an urgent bug. So we can move it to in process. And it appears in process. And we can keep moving it to in review and then to done. Ta-da! That's it. That's all it does. But that is enough to demonstrate. And obviously, you can obviously move these around as well. Oh, actually, we didn't start that one yet. And this one turned out it was really easy and it's done. So this is the whole app we're going to be building, and it might look pretty simple, but it demonstrates everything that you need to know to build React web apps. It just kind of has everything. It has almost everything. It has plenty. So this is what we're going to be building today. And let's dive in. before we dive in, just to let you know, there is a GitHub repo that accompanies this video series. It will be linked in the description of this video, and there you can download the finished code after each video, so you can kind of follow along at home. And then if something goes really wrong and you can't figure it out, you can download the finished code and compare and see what went wrong and kind of keep up. So yeah, make sure to go check that out. It's in the link below. I would highly encourage you to follow along at home. To do that, you're gonna need to install Node and npm, and that's about it, and npx. And some kind of code editor. So there'll be instructions in the README of the repo below about how to do that stuff. I'm not going to cover that in this video. So I'm assuming that you have Node, npm, npx installed, and pretty sure you can install that all in one go. And some kind of editor for editing your code. I recommend Visual Studio Code. It's great. So now we dive in. So first thing, we're going to open up a terminal. So every React project begins with this command: create React app. And then you give it the name of the project. So we're going to call this Kanban 1. And it's going to do some stuff. It's installing some stuff and running the command. Basically creating a development environment for you to be able to develop in React. I was going to get into something, but I'm going to wait because I'm going to get into it once we can actually look at the code. Okay, so create React app has finished, and it gives you this very helpful list of ideas about what to do. Mostly we want to go cd into the directory, and I'm now going to open up code editor so that we can look at what's going on. So node modules is a node thing. I'm not going to explain. Public is a bunch of public files. Source is where the action is. So source is the JavaScript and CSS and various things which come together to make our app. And this is the app. I'm just gonna clean this up real quick. I have a plugin that doesn't like the way that some of the code style choices, so I'm just gonna fix that real quick. Okay, that's better. Less angry red lines. So if you're not following along at home, I highly recommend you start following along at home. You can pause the video, do what you need to do to get set up. It's gonna be much more useful if you are also doing this at the same time with me. So I'll just show you what happens. So if we're now in the React app directory, and I'm going to say yarn start, and this is going to open this new React app in a browser window. Ta-da! And gives us some instructions: edit, source, app.js, and save to reload. So this is cool. It just reloads whenever you change the code. So now, look at that. Very handy for developing. Okay, so that's create React app. Do all of that, get to this point, and now I'm going to get a little more abstract and kind of talk about React components. So what is a component? So a React component is the kind of basic unit of structure of a React app. A React app is a tree of components. It's similar to how an HTML page is a tree of HTML elements. Actually very similar. And so when you're creating a React app, you're mostly thinking in terms of creating components and nesting them together into a tree. And so what a component does is it encapsulates all of the logic and the data, the state of a particular kind of piece of your app in such a way that it it kind of insulates the rest of the app from having to know too much about that component's job. So say you have a component which is a button, and it's a button which has a couple different states. It can be disabled, it can be enabled, or it can be in a loading state where you've maybe it's a submit button for a form. You hit the submit, and it's waiting for the server to come back and say, okay, we're good to go. And so it has these different states. So you would build that as a single component in React, which manages its own state and hides from the wider component what's going on internally between these different things. And instead, it just it reveals as small of a public API as possible. So what that means, it just reveals the things that the rest of the app really needs to have access to in order to use the component, and it doesn't do anything else. So that's pretty abstract, and hopefully it's going to make more sense once we start building some components. So we're going to begin. So first of all, we're just going to clean out a bunch of this stuff because we don't need this, and we don't really need any of this. I am just in one go, I'm gonna just copy across all of my CSS from the finished app because this is not a CSS tutorial, and so there's the CSS, and the dog is getting excited about something. Okay, so we've cleaned out some stuff in here, made it simpler, and now if we go and look, there, simpler. Just says hi there. So this is the starting point for building our app. So we're gonna build some components. Now I'll show you something right now. Let me just put that back so it stops complaining. This is a component. So our app component is it's itself just a component. So you can see already how we make a component. It's a function. A brief aside, you can also, there are other ways of creating components. Most commonly, you can create a class component. And there is a whole tutorial on the React website that kind of takes you through, it's really helpful, takes you through some of the same stuff we're going to be going through in text form using class components. The reason that we're using function components in this tutorial is because they're way, way better. They're just much better. They're easier to read, and this is, of course, a philosophical position. People might want to argue with me about this. I find them much easier to read, kind of easier to think about, and less typing. So we're going to be using function components. That's not super important, but just know you might read other people's React code where it says React.component. It uses a component and extends the component class, and it's a class. So it uses the JavaScript class syntax and all of that. We're not doing that. We're using functions. So this is a component, and it's very simple. It's a function that returns this stuff that kind of looks like HTML. And so you don't really need those parentheses. I'm not personally a fan, but if you like it, you can do that. So we're returning this HTML looking stuff. This HTML looking stuff is technically called JSX, which I don't know what it stands for. JavaScript Expression Language, something like that. Anyway, it's very similar to HTML. The difference is you can obviously put HTML elements in here. You can put whatever you want in there. But you can also put in other React components. So that's the big difference. And you can also kind of you can embed little bits of just plain JavaScript in there as well. All of that you're going to see pretty soon. So this is a component, and this is, the basics of it. Now this is an important component. It's a special component. The reason it's special, it's exported out of this file, and then in index.js, we import it, and we use it, we render it inside of this React DOM.render. You don't need to understand too much about this because it's kind of just all done for you when you do create React app, although it's good to understand it. But basically, this is just how the React code ends up on your HTML page, which means you can look at it here. Although there's nothing to look at right now because apparently I got rid of this. Oh yeah. So, but that's all I'm going to say about that. This is the stuff you really need to understand in order to build apps. So we're going to create a component. Now, if you remember back to the thing that we're building, which I'll just bring up very briefly. Okay, so here's what we're building. So we have some columns, and then inside of each column is some tickets, and then there's also an add button that expands it to a form, and the tickets open up to reveal a form element as well. So one of the things you want to do when you're thinking about building an app is start to break it down into components. That's kind of the first thing that you do. So what are some of the components here? Why don't you pause the video and just to kind of think about it, just throw some things out. There are a few components that jump out. Let's think about what they are. Okay, you back? So here's what I see. And there are different ways of breaking things down. So it doesn't, if you're not, if you are not saying exactly the same things as I am about what the components are, that's not a big deal. But make sure it's the same kinds of things. So you'll get it when I start talking about it. So there are columns. We're going to make a column component. Each column has cards. So we're going to make a card component. There's also an add button. So we're going to make an add card. There's an add button and a form. We're going to make one component which encapsulates both of those. It's really two states of the same thing. But that's debatable. You might have an add button and then a separate form component. That would be fine. There are headers. We're not going to make those as a separate component. They don't really do enough. They're just part of the column component. But somebody else might make those as its own component, especially if you might want to use those headers in multiple different places. So part of what's cool about components is you can compose them. So maybe we would have a different kind of column that had different content, but it wanted to have a similar header with a similar style. We might use a component for that. And yeah, I think those are the components that I'm seeing. So let's start by building a column component. So we're going to make a new function. I'm going to call it column. And we are going to return some stuff. I'm going to return a header. Remember all of these styles. So here right now, that's just a CSS style. Oh, in JSX, you call it class name, whereas in HTML, you would call it a class. So that's one of the subtle differences between JSX and HTML. There are a few things that are named slightly differently. That's one of them. It's a little bit annoying. It's a little bit of a gotcha, but you get used to it pretty fast. So we're going to call it header, and that's going to be enough for our column right now. Excuse me. We're actually going to call this column, and then header. So because it's difficult to think, write code, and talk about what you're doing all at the same time, I'm taking this from code I've already written. So this is not pouring straight from my head, although it did the first time. Header title, but this time having to do a lot of things at once. So now we're going to replace, so let me pause here and say, here's our function. Column, this is our component, our column component. And we're just going to put a few in here. So column, and so if, just like in normal HTML and XML in general, you can have a self-closing element. So that's what we're doing here. So we're putting in 4 columns just like in our app. I'm going to go look. And okay, that's interesting. So we have header title. We just have header, 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 header. There's a couple of things that are different between our header titles and these. Most notably, or our columns and these. Most notably, it's missing these other components, which we haven't written yet, but also the background colors. So we just, oh, and the different titles. That's really important. So what we're going to do, we're going to need some data to populate these things. Because right now, they all have the same title, which is just this. So we need to find some way of passing in a title and a color to the column to specify what title and color it should have. So we're going to do that by passing in what are called props. Props stands for properties. It's very similar to function parameters or arguments. So we're passing in these props. It's basically, it comes in as one object, and then we're destructuring here. So look up object destructuring syntax if that is not familiar to you in JavaScript. And so we want two things. We want a name, and we want a color. Let's call that title and color. So title goes there, and then I'm going to copy and paste that because it's slightly more typing than I want to do. And then this just styles, this just passes a style directly into the component. This is just a JavaScript object with the styles, background color, color. So how do we, so that's our component now can take a title and a color. How do we pass them in up here? It's pretty simple. We just say title equals, and then we're going to say ready. And I think you see where this is going. Same for each thing in process, in review, and done. And then we need a color. And so I'm just going to grab these colors from the one that I already did. Okay, so now we have titles and colors being passed as props into our component. Let's take a look. Look at that. It's a little different. I'm like, huh, why is that a little different? Because, I don't know why. Okay, so it's a little different because I put the background color on the column instead of on the header. Okay, so there are our columns. Now we might stop there and move on to cards, but you might notice this is a little bit repetitive, right? It's just saying the same thing over and over again. And so we can find a way to simplify that. It's also not very flexible, right? Like if later on we wanted to add a new column, we would have to add it down here and type in the color separately. If we wanted to pull it from a database, that wouldn't really, maybe we want a Kanban board that has like a icebox column as well, and we want that to be customizable. So, having it be hard-coded in this way into the app makes it not that useful. So we want to get this from some data. So the way we're going to do that for now, although this is going to change later on, but right now we're just going to create a const, and it's going to be called default columns. And I'm going to put it in and clean up a bunch of stuff. Okay, so we have an array, default columns, and it has an ID and a color for each field. We're calling this ID here for reasons which will become clear later on in a future video rather than title, but the idea is the same. So now, how do we take this data and turn it into a list of columns? Well, if you know JavaScript, then you know about map. If you don't know about map, go learn about map. It's very, very useful. So what map does is you start with an array, and then you pass map a function, and it applies the function to each element of the array, and then returns an array, which is the result of having applied the function to each thing. So I'm not going to explain map in more detail than that. Go read about map. It's really useful. So again, we're going to use object destructuring syntax here to get the ID and the color out of each column. And then we are going to return from the function a column. So one of the ways that JSX works is if you have an array, if you return, well, let me explain something first, but let me finish that thought. If you return an array of components, it just puts it in line one after the other exactly as you would hope. Now, I just introduced a new syntax without explaining it, which I'm now going to explain. These curly brackets inside of your JSX just say, okay, we're just going to, inside of here, we're going to put pure JavaScript, we're going to execute it, and then we're going to embed the result of whatever that JavaScript is directly into the JSX. So here we're returning an array of components, which is just going to get embedded into the JSX as a stack of components. So what we now need to do is take this ID, which remember is the title, and pass it into the column. I'm going to change the name of this prop to ID because later that's going to be really, really useful. And then color. So this is, this might look a bit foreign, but this is really just, we're passing ID, this variable ID as a property ID into column, and this variable color as a property color into the column. Now if I change that to ID, and we go back and look. So now, look at that. Now we have ready and processing, review, and done with our colors, but we're not doing it by hand. We're doing it from the data. So if we wanted to add that icebox before ready, it's as simple as changing the data. Now, let me see if I can figure out a cold blue. It's going to be high up here and a bit lower here and here. That's probably too high. Okay, wish me luck. I got purple. So that's our icebox. So you see, it was as easy as that. Now, what we could do instead is get the columns from equals fetch columns from server, right? And then you can see that each person using the app could customize their columns because you're fetching it from the server. We're not doing that in this app because we're not dealing with the backend. And I'm going to take out icebox. Okay, so there's our first component, column. Next, we need a card component. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. Okay, so I've now added the card component, and I've done things in a slightly different way, and I've changed column to do it the same way, and this is going to be useful soon, and you'll see why. But rather than passing in things individually, I'm just passing in a whole card. So we're going to figure out what a card object looks like soon, but the same with columns. So rather than passing in ID and color separately, I'm just passing in a column. So what that means is I need to change the props up here and pass in a column. And so a column is just an object consisting of an ID and a color right now. So this is when we map over default columns, we get a column and we just pass it straight in. So this is doing the same thing that the last code did. It's just rather than passing the ID and color in separately as separate props, it's passing them together as an object we're calling a column. And we're going to do the same thing with card. but first we need some cards. So let's put some cards in our default columns data. And I'm just going to do that by copying and pasting, but then we're going to take a quick look. So what we've done, is still an ID and a color in each column, but now we've added cards. So cards is just an array with objects which have an ID and a text. The ID is going to be useful later. For right now, I'm just leaving it in, and the text is the text you want on the card. So here, in the ready column we have 1 card, and then in the in process column we have 3 cards, etc., etc. So you can follow along at home. You can use the same text that I've used, or you can add your own cards. But now we need to get that and render the card component. So it's going to be very similar to what we did with column. So inside of column, we're just going to map. So first of all, we're going to pull cards out of the column. So each column has an array of cards which we can extract by using this destructuring syntax. And then we're using the syntax again that says evaluate this JavaScript expression and embed the result inside of the JSX, and we're going to do the same thing. This is a pattern you will do over and over again in React, so get used to it. We're going to map over cards, and then for each card, so the way you can read this is, for each card, return this, and it's going to be a card. And I'm going to do it on a new line just to be tidy, and we're just going to pass in the card into the card component. Now, one thing I didn't explain, which I just remembered, is your functions have to start with a capital letter for them to work as JSX. This is how JSX can tell the difference between an HTML element and a custom component, a React component. Is it capitalized? And so you need to capitalize your function names. It's just a little gotcha that you need to be aware of when writing components. So now we're mapping over our cards, and we're returning some HTML, and this is pure HTML again. And let's take a look. There you go. Okay. Now notice when I click on it right now, nothing happens, right? In the finished one, there's like interactivity. So we haven't built that yet. Right now, we're just rendering the component. Now, there's one more component to render, which is the add card button. That is pretty trivial. I'm just going to copy and paste it. Okay, so here's our add card form. It's right now it's so simple, and I'm calling it add card form because later on it's going to be a form. Right now, it would make more sense to call it add card button, but I don't want to change the names. And right now, it's so simple that it almost would not be worth making a component out of. We're not passing it any props, and it's just returning a single div. But we're going to leave it as a component because later on it's going to start doing some stuff. So in order to include that in our column, we're just going to add it to the bottom after the cards. So add card form. And now, there you go. So now, it looks identical. I'm switching between the two, and they look identical. Now, the difference is we haven't implemented any of this behavior yet in the one that we're doing. All of that is going to come in future videos. But we have to start by just creating these components, and that's what we've done. So many times, this is how you will build a React app. Is you start. This is what happened. We started with looking at a design. It happened to be a working version of the app, but this could easily also be a design that you're handed. And we kind of broke it down into components, and then we built the components without any functionality, just displaying, rendering how we want them to render, but not implementing any of the functionality. And then we're going to get to that later on. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. You can let me know in GitHub in the issues, or you can let me know on YouTube in the comments if you have questions, if you get stuck anywhere, if there's something you want to know more about, and look for the next video very soon. All right. Thanks for watching. Take care.